In-between times. We don't like in-between times. We like when things are settled, when we know what to expect. But in-between times characterize certainly some chapters of our lives. Earlier this year, I watched in-between times play out in one branch of my family. My mom had started talking about how the house she bought with my dad over 15 years ago was probably too big for her in the long run. I think, winter snow removal was the thing that was starting to tip the balance, that she just didn't want to deal with anymore. Then my brother and his wife found out that the school district in their town had moved the attendance lines across their neighborhood. So their kids were pretty soon not going to be able to attend the schools they'd been, in and planning to attend. And so they think, well, we've been talking about maybe it's time to move. So they're looking in certain neighborhoods where they can go to the schools they're already going to, and pretty soon I hear we're in an in-between time because mom's looking at houses and my brother and his family are looking at houses. They're looking at houses together. They're starting to talk about maybe the house my brother and his family want is my mom's house. But then that puts my mom on a timeline because they've got to be moved by a certain time. And so until my mom finds the condo and my brother's house sells, then things are settled, right? And it's interesting. The ink is dry. There's a whole lot of money that still has to move around and a whole lot of stuff that has to be moved around, but we know where it's leading, and it feels settled again. We don't like the in-between times. I'll tell you one in my life. If you're a foster to adopt family, and you have a child who you are deeply in love with and seems to need a home, but whose legal status is not yet settled, that is an in-between time, and something longs to see it settled. Nobody likes an in-between time. We want things to be settled, but we have to admit, I think, that in-between times are times of interesting possibilities. Jesus loved to talk about this. It's a way to understand many of the stories that he told, almost elongating that moment of being in between, right? He told these stories about banquets. Somebody plans a banquet and sends out invitations, and then there's this in-between time. A lot can happen before the guests finally show up and the dinner is served and they're admitted into the banquet hall. Jesus liked to tease out what can happen in between. The parable that I still think is at least my favorite to preach, even if it isn't my favorite to hear the gospel through. But I love the dishonest manager in Luke 16. This story, it's about an in-between time. It's this guy, he's been accused of swindling or cheating his employer. He's the manager, and people have brought accusations against him, and so the employer says, that's it, I'm done with you. But the manager realizes, okay, I'm getting fired, but I still hold the books. There's a little in-between time, and it has interesting possibilities. So he goes around to people who owe his employer money and says, here, take a look on this ledger. Let's adjust this for you a little bit. Right? He sees the possibilities of an in-between time. Well, Advent is about in-between times. And maybe that's why it isn't one of the more popular seasons of the church year, because we don't like in-between times. But that is at the heart of each week's proclamation here. We talk a lot about the prophets in Advent. And with the prophets, there's always a promise and a fulfillment. And the promise has been spoken, but the fulfillment hasn't come yet. And we're in the in-between time. Starting next Sunday, and then Christmas Eve, we'll be with Mary and Joseph. A wonderful couple who find themselves in the in-between times. That interesting time between we got engaged and we're married. A lot can happen, it turns out. That interesting in-between time between pregnancy and birth. Yeah, nobody flips a switch and suddenly becomes a parent. There's a journey there. And we join them on that journey in the in-between time. Well, John the Baptist. We spent last week with John. We hear John again now. Now he's in prison. He is one who is eagerly awaiting the Messiah. He's already in a sort of in-between time, that between promise and fulfillment. He's saying the Messiah is coming and almost here. John, the one who in some ways is the first to recognize Jesus for who he is. He's certainly ahead of almost everyone else. But it's interesting to hear him in prison sending his disciples with a question. John has a deep question at this point because he may have gotten one thing wrong about the Messiah. He may have thought, and his proclamation shows us, he may have thought the Messiah was going to come and settle things once and for all, because that's what we want, right? We want things to be settled. And in part, this is true. We can talk about Jesus as coming and settling so many things that need settling. But we can also talk about Jesus unsettling things. Jesus doesn't meet all of John's expectations. Jesus coming introduces a new in-between time. Well, John, like so many, probably like us, we've been taught to expect certain things. John seems to be expecting a sudden, complete, definitive resolution in 3 acts, you might say. The first act is now, when a lot of things are not so good. Act 2 is the judgment, a crisis of sorting and purging, a sudden series of events that sorts out the good and the bad and purges the bad. And then Act 3, the restoration, when everything is as it should be. That judgment, again, we conceive of it differently. It's the time when the wicked are defeated. When we put it in political or social terms, we picture this is when the traitors will be revealed and driven out, or when the oppressors will be overthrown. In religious terms, we think of this is when the impure will be shown for who they are, and the faithless will be cast out. And then the restoration. The restoration in so much of history and in many of our myths is the return of the king. In Robin Hood, it's good King Richard comes back. In The Lord of the Rings, the 3rd book is actually called The Return of the King. The right one is in charge. All things are set right. Paradise is regained. And if this sounds biblical to you, you are not wrong in that impression. Many of the prophets speak very much in this way. The prophets that John has studied and is in some ways he joins them. Revelation gives very much this impression. Sometimes it even fits with how Jesus talks about his return in the final days. But that's not what John is seeing in this moment. And so he has questions. And before proceeding too far, I do just want to stop for a moment and make sure you hear John the Baptist having doubts. Because there is an odd comfort in that. Because we are people of faith whose faith never exists without also doubts. Faith always, to some extent, exists alongside of doubt. And here, the most faithful person of his generation, and he doesn't understand it all. And he's not free of doubts, even perhaps here racked by doubts in prison. And you can't blame him, can you? What isn't quite spoken in this question is, if you are the Messiah, why am I behind bars? That's not what John says, but as one commentator I read says, what kind of Messiah leaves the forerunner in prison? Can't blame him for expecting something else. If you are who you say you are, why am I not being sprung right now? What is spoken is this question: are you the one who is to come, the one we've been expecting, or should we wait for another? You wish you'd get a straight answer from Jesus, but nobody ever gets quite a straight answer from Jesus. And if Jesus were to just say, yes, I am, we wouldn't learn a thing about the nature of who the Messiah is. If he just said yes, we'd go on expecting him to be whoever we were already expecting him to be, and we wouldn't learn anything about who the true Messiah is. Instead, Jesus says, tell John what you've seen and what you've heard. Jesus here has to share a new concept. Yes, he is the Messiah. No, he is not exactly the Messiah that John and perhaps we have expected. He's not bringing the definitive, sudden, complete resolution that John and so many others expect. His coming among us is initiating a new in-between time. Here are some other ways to express it. John, and perhaps we, expect a universal judgment followed by a universal restoration. What Jesus describes is a person-by-person approach, where some are already encountering the judgment and restoration while others have not encountered it openly. Person by person. Another way to put it, John, and perhaps we, expect a top-down, imposed judgment and restoration, beginning from the powerful in society and the decree. What Jesus describes is a bottom-up restoration, beginning with the lowly and the unnoticed. John and we expect a sudden and decisive event. Jesus describes something that is begun, but remains open-ended. Or perhaps the most succinct way to put it, Jesus hasn't triggered the end, which is what John expected. But he has brought the judgment and the restoration into the present moment. He brings the restoration that's promised, breaks into the present moment. Here, he doesn't talk about the judgment, except maybe in a roundabout way. He says, "Blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." Elsewhere, he'll be clear that judgment is enacted in how Jesus is received. Those who receive him have, in some sense, been judged and found righteous. Even if they aren't righteous, their righteousness is in their faith in him. And others encounter him and reject him. And he says that is the judgment in their lives. I think judgment plays out much like the manager in the parable. The manager who says, now Jesus plays that role, right? Going around and taking advantage of the in-between time to just forgive debts willy-nilly to anyone who will listen to him. That's how the judgment plays out in this in-between time. But what he quotes to John is about the restoration. Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the poor have good news brought to them. The restoration is here in our midst. It can be seen and heard, he tells these disciples of John. It isn't complete. It has begun. It isn't universal in that sense that we can see it everywhere, but it is real. Person by person, spreading in those lives that are transformed. It is real already. It isn't a top-down decree, but it is stirring powerfully among the lowest of the low, the forgotten, the despised, the unnoticed one. The restoration has begun. Well, I'd love for you to take away two things from this. One is, if you want to see the restoration, look and listen where Jesus tells John's disciples to look and listen. Right? Jesus talks to the crowds here, and he says, don't look to the halls of power where people have the fancy clothes. In some sense, he's saying to the crowd, if you were looking to John already, you were on the right track. You understood that on some level, God wasn't necessarily going to act among the usual suspects where we would expect this to happen. No, you already understood. God is doing a new thing. And so look among the lowly. That's where the restoration is playing out already. This is why I feel like we got our Advent and Christmas calendar right this year. We found the sweet spot because all of our extras that we did during the season take us to someone who in some sense is forgotten or someone who's in need. We had this wonderful Christmas party with girls from the New Life Center who are in a time in their life where they're getting a peaceful place to receive treatment. And as we say, they don't call it New Life for nothing. Right? And then those who showed up Thursday and those who were involved last night, getting to tell the Christmas story to children, getting to tell that story to people who might not otherwise encounter that story this year. we're showing up in the right places to see the restoration that Jesus promises. Next week, the caroling, bringing Christmas worship to people who probably won't get to Christmas worship. Among the lowly, the ones who at least feel forgotten. There's something deeply wise in the Christian tradition that we make our preacher also someone who gets to spend a lot of time with people who are hurting, or maybe hungry, or maybe very young or very old, because we need to speak with conviction about this restoration entering in the world, and so we put that person, and I'm privileged so often to be there, where we see the restoration that Jesus speaks of. And if you want to see your faith renewed, then showing up for the lowly is where we will see and hear the things that Jesus has promised, and it does renew our faith to see God at work. Sometimes, people will say, I don't feel it anymore, or I need some renewal. We have clear direction here, where to go if we want to see God at work in this way. The second takeaway I'd love for you to have today is to notice that the in-between time that Jesus initiates us puts us squarely in the realm of faith, right? If you're living between promise and fulfillment, that's the in-between time. And that's where faith makes sense. We haven't seen the fulfillment yet. We live by faith, and it is where faith is so necessary. Faith is what God uses in our lives to allow us to participate in the judgment and the restoration, to bring them into the present moment, so that by faith you can receive your judgment now, sins forgiven for Jesus' sake. End of story. Experience the judgment already, and then by faith receive the restoration already, now, lives transformed and hopes renewed. It is by faith that Jesus brings those future promises to become a present reality. We acknowledge today that we live in an in-between time, and there are so many things we would prefer to have settled. But what is given to us is to live by faith, and only by faith. And in that life of faith, Christ, by his coming, brings the benefits of the restoration, and we receive them already now.